Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind howled hot through the gallows frame in Cheyenne as Beatrice Harlan stepped up to the hangman's platform in a borrowed dress and shackles. She had not cried when they sentenced her. Not when the marshal read out the charges: murder of a man in broad daylight, 2 witnesses, a knife left in the gut. Not when the prison matron whispered prayers behind her. But she nearly broke when her eyes landed on her son and daughter Frederick and Flora standing just outside the crowd, clutching each other like pups in a thunderstorm. They had no family left, no one willing to take them. The rope scratched her throat as the hangman adjusted the noose. Then came the voice. "I will marry her." The crowd turned. Beatrice did not. She knew better than to hope, but the voice rooted her in place. A man stepped forward from the dusty road, tall and lean, with a black duster over his shoulders and a Colt in his belt. His hat was tilted low, shadowing most of his face, but his voice was strong. "My name is Thayer Prescott," he said, loud enough for the judge to hear. "I own land out past Sweetwater Station. I will marry this woman today, take her and her children." "You got my word she will not run." The judge squinted at him. "You know what she's done." "I do, and I have killed for less." Gasps rolled through the crowd. Beatrice turned slowly, her breath caught, staring at the stranger who just saved her life. Thayer met her gaze. His eyes were steady. Not kind, not cruel, just steady. The judge called for silence. "If you are serious, Mr. Prescott, the law will permit it. But know this: if she runs or harms again, your protection means nothing." "I understand," Thayer said. The rope was pulled off her neck. Beatrice staggered, her legs weak, but she kept her head high as they unshackled her wrists. Her children ran to her, burying into her skirts. She held them both, heart hammering. An hour later, they stood inside the courthouse with a preacher, her hands trembling in Thayer's as he recited vows in a voice like dried riverrock. "I take you, Beatrice Harlan, as my wife." She repeated the same. Her voice cracked. When it was done, Thayer helped her onto his horse. The children rode behind in a small supply wagon. No one spoke as he led them west. It took 4 days to reach his homestead. The land was flat and wind-beaten, but the house was built strong: 2 rooms, a clean well, a barn with sturdy fences. She had not expected comfort. She had expected to be thrown in a shack and used worse than a prisoner. But Thayer showed her to the larger of the 2 rooms and said, "This one's yours and the children's. I sleep in the loft." He did not touch her, did not speak more than needed. The first night, Beatrice stayed awake long after the children had drifted off. She watched the moonlight creep across the wooden floor and wondered what kind of man he really was. By the second week, she had learned more. Thayer Prescott worked his land from dawn to dusk. He fixed the south fence with calloused hands and milked the cow that fed her children. He did not ask about her crime. He did not ask anything at all. She watched him from the porch one afternoon as he broke a wild mare. He moved with quiet strength, never raising his voice, just calm and sure. The horse bucked and twisted, but he stayed on. Never once did he lose his temper. Later, he brought her a sack of flour. "Found a trader near the canyon. Thought you might need this." "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her. "Because your boy eats like a bear and your girl likes warm bread." That night, she baked for the first time in months. The smell pulled Thayer in from his work. He stood near the doorway, not expecting a plate, but she handed him one anyway. He nodded once, then took a bite. Beatrice sat across from him while the children played with carved wooden animals Thayer had quietly left in their room the day before. "You said you killed for less," she said finally. He chewed slowly. "I have." "Why?" Thayer looked up, his eyes unreadable. "Because when a man hurts a woman or a child, he does not deserve to breathe." Her hands went still. He set down his plate. I do not need to know what you did, but if you ever feel like telling me, I will listen." The next morning, she found him chopping wood. She stood by the tree line, arms crossed. "I was 17. The man was 32, she said. "He cornered me in the storeroom of the butcher's. I told him no. He laughed, so I stabbed him." Thayer paused, axe mid-air. "I worked there to feed my children. I gave birth to Frederick at 15. Flora came a year later. Their father left before she was born. He lowered the axe. "I would do it again," she said, voice steady. Thayer turned to her. "Good." She blinked. "I would have done the same thing," he said, then picked up the next log. That night, she stood at the window while the children slept, watching Thayer feed the horses under the moonlight. Her chest ached not from fear, but from something deeper, something quieter. In the weeks that followed, the air between them shifted. He taught Frederick how to ride, helped Flora plant beans. He built a swing for the children under the old cottonwood. One night, a storm rolled in. Beatrice woke to the sound of thunder and Flora crying. She picked up her daughter and found Thayer already at the door, lantern in hand. "The barn," he said. "The roof's shaking." They ran out together, wind slapping their faces. Inside the barn, the horses were panicked. Thayer calmed them with low words, moving slow and sure. A beam cracked above. Beatrice did not think. She pushed Flora into his arms. The beam came down behind her, catching her shoulder. Pain flared hot. Thayer shouted. He set the child down and reached her in seconds, lifting the beam with a grunt and pulling her out. He held her all the way back to the house, rain soaking them both. Her arm was bruised but not broken. He wrapped it with care, his fingers gentle. She looked at him, soaked hair clinging to her face. "You did not have to come after me," she whispered. "You are my wife," he said simply. "I would come through fire for you." She reached for his hand. He let her. And for the first time since the courthouse, she felt safe. The frost came early that year. By mid-September, the grass turned brittle underfoot and the mornings carried a bite that clung to the lungs. Beatrice rose before daylight now, pulling her shawl tight as she lit the stove. Frederick helped haul water while Flora swept ashes from the hearth, her small face set in quiet purpose. Thayer had already ridden out before dawn, taking the rifle and a sack of salt. He'd mentioned elk tracks in the hills. She watched the trail for a long time after he vanished past the cottonwoods, the silence of the prairie pressing in like a held breath. By midday, she took to mending the wagon canvas, needle trembling more from the cold than nerves. The wind rattled the shutters, but the house held firm. Thayer had built it well, too well for someone who lived alone so many years. She kept wondering about that. "Ma," Frederick said, swinging his legs from the porch rail. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up. "Go on. Did he know us? Before Cheyenne?" "No," she said, tying off a stitch. "Not a soul did." Frederick chewed his lip. "Then why'd he come for us?" Beatrice pulled the canvas into her lap, smoothing the rough fabric. "That's something I'm still trying to understand." He nodded like that made sense and went to help Flora with the kindling. Thayer returned near sundown, an elk quarter slung over his pack horse and blood drying on his sleeve. He didn't speak until he'd strung the meat in the smokehouse and washed at the pump. When he finally stepped inside, the children were already asleep on the pallet by the stove. Beatrice handed him a tin of coffee. "You find them far?" "3 ridges north," he said, drying his hands on a rag. "Snow up there already. We'll see flurries by next week." She rested against the table's edge, watching him take a slow sip. His jaw bore a fresh scrape, likely from brush or antler. He hadn't shaved in days. The lines around his mouth looked deeper in the lantern light. "Where'd you learn to hunt like that?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Set the tin down, arms crossed over his chest. "My father was a trapper," he said finally. "Taught me early." After he died, I worked freight trails, army contracts in Montana. Then I stopped. Why? He met her eyes. Because I got tired of watching good men die for someone else's money. She nodded once. You ever been married? No. Why not? He rubbed his thumb along the tin's rim. Didn't see the use in tying someone to a life like mine. Hard land, hard sleep, no peace in it. But you took us in. I saw something in your face, he said, voice low. Not fear, not shame, just a woman who wouldn't break. The room went quiet again, save for the ticking of the mantel clock. She stepped closer. You said once you'd killed for less. He didn't flinch. I meant it. Did it change you? He looked down, then away. It made me quieter. She reached for his wrist, fingers brushing the worn flannel. You could have let me hang. I couldn't. Why not? He didn't answer. She let her hand fall. Tomorrow, he said, voice steadying, I'll ride into town for salt blocks and nails. Anything else we need? She shook her head. He nodded once and turned toward the loft ladder. That night, Beatrice lay awake, listening to the wind tug at the eaves, to the slow creak of boards above as Thayer settled into sleep. She thought of the way his voice had caught when he spoke of her face, the quiet reverence behind it. No man had looked at her like that before. Not with want, not with claim, just recognition. Come morning, she rose before the sun again, but this time she waited at the table with hot coffee and a packed saddlebag. When Thayer came down, she handed them to him without a word. He paused, then took them with a nod. As he climbed onto his horse, she stepped out onto the porch. Thayer, she called. He turned. I didn't break, but I was close. His gaze softened. You're not close now. And then he was gone down the trail, the hooves fading into the wind. The first frost came with a silence that clung to the sod like breath held too long. Beatrice woke to its hush, the windows rimmed in pale lace, and the wool blankets heavier with the cold. She dressed in the gray light, careful not to wake the children, and stepped outside. The sky was the color of tin, the air sharp enough to sting her nose. She carried the wash basin to the pump and watched her breath drift as she worked. Thayer didn't return that day. By dusk, she'd fed the children, banked the fire, and lit the lantern in the window. The wind had picked up, blowing hard from the west, and with it came a kind of unease she couldn't explain. He hadn't said how long he'd be gone, but she'd counted 2 full days since he'd left. She didn't worry easily, not anymore, but the quiet gnawed at her. On the 3rd morning, Flora woke coughing, her cheeks flushed and eyes glassy. Beatrice pressed her hand to the child's forehead and felt heat rise like a kettle on boil. Stay in bed, she said gently, tucking the quilt tighter. Frederick, bring in dry wood. We'll need the stove strong. By late afternoon, Flora had stopped eating. Her breath rasped shallow and fast, and Beatrice could hear the wheeze in her chest. She boiled onion and mustard seed, crushed horehound she'd dried in summer, and prayed she remembered enough from an old midwife's teachings to keep the fever from climbing. Night came heavy. She sat by the bed, damp cloth in hand, listening to the wind beat against the shutters. Frederick dozed in the rocker, boots still on. When the latch on the front door lifted near midnight, she didn't startle. Thayer stepped inside, his coat soaked and hat dripping. Mud clung to his boots. He closed the door behind him and looked at her face before he said a word. I saw the lantern, he said, voice low. Then his eyes flicked to Flora. How long? Since yesterday morning. She hasn't kept broth down since noon. He crossed the room in 2 strides, touching the girl's wrist, then her throat, then lifting her gently to listen to her back. His jaw tightened. She's drowning in it. Beatrice stood beside him, trying not to tremble. Is there anything? I'll get the bellows. She watched him move fast but sure, taking the stove pipe apart and fitting the small bellows through the end. She hadn't known he'd done this before, hadn't known it was even possible. But within minutes he had Flora propped upright, coaxing air into her lungs in slow, careful bursts. When she coughed, it came deep and wet, but something in her color lightened. Beatrice knelt beside him, her hand on her daughter's back. "How did you know what to do?" "I've seen it before." He didn't look at her. "A child in Fort Laramie. Medicine man showed me. You trusted him. I watched him save 4. He adjusted the bellows again. I stopped asking questions after that. They stayed like that through the night. When Flora finally slept, her breathing easier, Thayer sat back against the wall and closed his eyes. Beatrice tucked the blanket around her daughter, then turned to him. "Thank you." He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "I would have carried her through the mountains if I had to." She sat beside him, knees brushing. "Did something happen in town?" His eyes opened. "Sheriff's dead." She blinked. "What happened?" "2 men came through looking for someone, turned on each other before noon. Sheriff tried to break it up, took a bullet under the ribs. Did you see it?" "I was behind the stable, heard the shot, saw the blood, held him while he died." She took that in slowly. "Did you know him?" Thayer nodded once. "He gave me grazing rights 6 years ago. Trusted me when others wouldn't." She didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say that didn't feel thin. "I buried him myself," Thayer added. "The undertaker was drunk. No one else stepped forward." Beatrice placed her hand over his. "I'm sorry." He looked down at their joined hands but didn't pull away. "You've lost people?" she asked. "All of them," he said. "Long ago." She leaned her head against his shoulder. His shirt smelled of wood smoke and wet wool. He didn't move, but she felt his breath shift. "I didn't expect you to know how to save her," she said. "I didn't expect to care this much," he replied. The words settled deep, quiet and sure. By morning, Flora's fever broke. She woke with a weak smile and a whisper for water. Beatrice wept then, but only after the girl had fallen back asleep. Thayer stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "I need to check the barn." Beatrice followed him outside, pulling her shawl tight. The frost had melted into the earth, leaving the ground soft beneath their boots. He checked the latches, fed the horses, and forked hay without speaking. She watched him move, the same steady patience in every task. She waited until he turned toward her. "I want to stay," she said. He stilled. "I mean it," she went on. "I know I'm here because of circumstance. But I don't want to leave, not now, not when I'm starting to feel like I belong somewhere." He stepped closer, his voice rough. "You do." "I need to know," she said, eyes steady. "Do you want me here?" "I haven't wanted anything in years," he said. "But every time I ride out, I'm afraid something will happen while I'm gone, that I'll come back," and she reached up, cupping his cheek. "You'll always come back." He kissed her then. It wasn't tender or slow. It was real, hard-earned, and full of all the things they hadn't said. The wind carried through the grass, but neither of them moved. They stood there a long time, the prairie wide around them, the house warm behind them, and every piece of their old lives falling quiet beneath the steady beat of something new. The wind had shifted by late October, carrying the scent of snow off the high country. Beatrice felt it in her knees when she crouched too long near the root cellar, and in the way the chickens huddled closer than usual before dusk. The land had grown quiet, each tree holding its breath, waiting. That morning, Thayer brought in a cedar sapling, roots bundled in burlap, and set it near the porch without a word. She found him digging a hole just past the cottonwood, his breath rising in steady clouds. "For shade?" she asked. He paused, turning the shovel upright. "For roots." She stepped beside him, brushing dirt from her palms. "It'll take years to grow tall." "I'll be here," he said. She watched the muscles in his forearms shift beneath his sleeves as he dug, the way his jaw worked when he concentrated. It struck her not as something new, but as something she hadn't fully let in until now, how entirely he'd folded her into his life without asking anything back, not even her affection. Later, While she scrubbed the basin and Flora napped, Frederick helped Thayer string a new line of wire around the far pasture. She saw them from the window, her boy walking taller when he stood beside him, not needing to be told what to do. That evening, Thayer came in with a torn cuff and a fresh scrape on his knuckle. "Fence post slipped," he said as she poured water into the basin. She dipped the cloth without pause, took his hand, and began wiping the blood away. "You could have called for Frederick. He was carrying the line." "I had the post." She looked up. "You always take the harder part." "Habit." She wrapped the scrape in linen and tied a knot. Her hands lingered. "Did you ever think about children of your own?" she asked. He leaned back on the stool, eyes steady. "Once, before I had land. Before I knew what kind of man I was capable of being when cornered." "You still could." He shook his head once. "I never figured I'd live long enough to see anything grow." She folded the cloth and set it aside. "You're not that man anymore." He stood and crossed the room to the window. "I'm not sure I ever stopped being him." She joined him, watching the sky bruise purple above the horizon. "You'd never raise your hand to anyone in this house. I know it." He turned toward her, the last light catching the edge of his cheek. "There was a time I didn't know what I'd do with my own anger. I used to walk into town with my fists clenched, just waiting for someone to give me a reason. And now, I'd rather build." His voice had gone softer. "I'd rather come home." Her hand found his. He laced their fingers slowly, like it still surprised him she'd want to. The next morning, a wagon rolled up the trail, wheels crunching over frost-hardened dirt. A man climbed down broad-shouldered, with a black hat and coat stiff with dust. He carried a satchel and a rifle, but neither in a way that spoke of threat. Thayer stepped out first, his hand never far from his belt. Beatrice stayed by the doorway, watching. "Prescott," the man called. "It's Bishop, out of Rawlins." Thayer nodded. "I remember. Came through looking for work. Heard you might need help clearing timber come spring." Thayer didn't speak right away, then he jerked his chin. "You know how to sharpen a draw knife, better than most." Thayer glanced back at her. She nodded once. "You can bed down in the barn," Thayer said. "There's oats in the bin and water at the pump." Bishop tipped his hat. "Much obliged." That night, as the wind picked up and dry leaves chased across the porch, Beatrice lit the lamp and found Thayer near the hearth, sharpening his blade with slow, even strokes. She stood behind him, laying her hands on his shoulders. "You trust him?" "No," he said, "but I trust my gut." She pressed her thumbs gently into the knots along his neck. "What does it say?" "That he's running from something, same as we were." She didn't ask more. Some stories came in time. Others never did. Later, when the children were asleep and the fire had settled to coals, she sat beside Thayer on the edge of the bed. For weeks, they'd shared quiet touches and passing warmth, but never crossed further. She reached for his hand, fingers brushing the scar that ran along the base of his thumb. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. He looked at her, face unreadable. "I thought I might be. At first, not because of what you'd done, but because I didn't know if you could ever belong to someone. And now I think you already do." He stood slowly, then knelt before her, hands on either side of her knees. "I've never offered myself to anyone," he said. "Not fully, not without a price." She leaned down, cupping his face. "Then offer it now. No price, no chains, just this life." He rose, kissed her once, and then again, deeper, with a care that felt like a vow. That night, as the wind howled through the eaves and the fire burned low, they lay together in the quiet, not as strangers, not as a bargain struck under the gallows, but as two people who had chosen, against all odds, to trust the shape of something whole. And in the darkness, Beatrice reached for him not out of need, but out of want, and Thayer came to her like he'd never known another place he was meant to be. The snow came in early November, blanketing the pasture in long, white hush. It fell without sound, slow and steady, gathering against the fence railings and softening the edges of the world. Beatrice stood at the window with a steaming mug, watching the flakes drift past the glass, the heat from the stove warming the backs of her legs. Outside, Thayer and Frederick hauled water to the barn, boots crunching through the fresh powder. Since the cold set in, Thayer had started giving Frederick more to do on his own, less as a boy, more as a hand. Beatrice had seen the change in her son's shoulders, the way he stood straighter when Thayer handed him the rope or asked his opinion on the grain bin repairs. Inside, Flora practiced her letters at the table, tongue pressed to her lip in concentration. Beatrice glanced over her shoulder and gently corrected the curve of an R. "You're better than I was at your age," she said. Flora didn't look up. "I want to be a teacher someday, like Miss Laramie in Cheyenne." Beatrice brushed a hand through her daughter's hair. "You'll be whatever you want. Might not be Miss Laramie, but I'll teach you what I know." She didn't say it out loud, but she'd already begun copying out lessons from memory, making slates out of old kindling boards and chalk from crushed limestone Thayer brought back from the ridge. She wanted Flora to know more than survival. She wanted her to know choice. That afternoon, Thayer came in with stiff fingers and a new gash across his knuckle. He eased into the chair by the stove without a word, holding his hands out to the heat. Beatrice crouched beside him with a cloth and a small tin of pine salve. "What happened?" Horse kicked the gate. "I caught the nail head." She cleaned the cut, careful with the edges. "You need to stop using the same gloves from last winter. They're worn clean through," he grunted. "Can't find a pair thick enough that still lets me grip the wire." "I'll make you a pair," she said, dabbing salve with her thumb. "I've got leather scraps from the saddle bag." He looked at her, eyes softening. "You always find a way to fix things." She tied off the linen strip and gave his hand a squeeze. "So do you." That night, they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed, the room lit only by the low orange glow. Beatrice had taken to sewing in the evenings, but tonight her hands rested still in her lap. Thayer leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She studied the flames. "You mean spring or further?" "Further." She didn't answer right away. "I used to think getting through the day was enough. Then I thought making it through the trial was all I'd ever get. Now I can feel time again, like it's not just passing over me but opening up." He sat back, nodding slowly. "I've been thinking about that too." She turned to him. "What do you want, Thayer?" His answer came quiet, but without hesitation. "I want to raise those children like they're my own. I want to build a schoolhouse, even if it's just one room and a crooked desk. I want to plant trees and know I'll be around to see them shade the porch. And me," he reached for her hand, slipping his fingers through hers. "You're not something I want. You're something I need. You're the first thing that's felt right in a long time." Her breath caught, not from surprise but from how simply he said it. "I want to marry you," he said. "Properly. Not with a noose waiting, with a dress you choose, with your children holding flowers. And if you'll have me, I want to raise a life with you, one that's ours in every way." She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and sure, her hand pressed to his chest. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." They told the children the next morning over buckwheat cakes. Flora clapped, then asked if she could wear ribbons. Frederick tried to act unimpressed, but his eyes crinkled at the corners. That Sunday, Bishop hitched the wagon and drove them into Sweetwater Station. The preacher there still remembered Thayer from a time he'd helped pull a drowning boy from the river. He agreed to preside without question. Beatrice wore a dress dyed deep indigo, one she'd sewn from bolts traded for dried apples and stitched late at night when the children were asleep. She walked up the chapel steps with Thayer beside her, her children just behind and no chains at her wrists. When Thayer spoke his vows this time, his voice didn't catch. It rang with quiet certainty, each word a promise forged in action. Beatrice met his gaze and spoke hers in kind. "I choose you. I walk toward you. I build with you." Afterward, they rode home under a sky the color of buttermilk, the sun low but warm. The children laughed in the back of the wagon, tossing dried flower petals over each other. Thayer's hand rested lightly on hers, his thumb tracing the edge of her knuckles. That night they lay in bed with the window cracked open, cool air drifting in over the quilt she'd pieced from scraps. He curled around her, one hand resting low at her hip, his breath warm against her neck. "I never thought I'd feel this much peace," he whispered. She turned to face him, brushing her fingers down his jaw. "Then we hold on to it. Whatever comes." He kissed her temple. "Whatever comes." The seasons passed. Snow melted into creek water and the cottonwoods budded pale green. Frederick turned 13, quiet and capable, and rode into town alone for the first time. Flora read aloud from the Bible each evening, stumbling only when the words ran long. Bishop built his own cabin near the West Ridge, and when he met a widow from Lander, he asked Thayer to stand witness at their wedding. Beatrice opened the schoolhouse in the spring, a single room with benches and a wide slate wall, and taught not just Flora but 3 other children from nearby homesteads. Her hands remained busy, but her heart was never restless again. One evening, she and Thayer sat on the porch while the sun dipped low across the pasture, the cedar sapling now waist-high and sturdy. Thayer rested his hand over hers. "This is the life I never thought I deserved." She leaned into his shoulder. "It's the life we earned." And there, under a sky streaked with gold, they stayed together, whole and at peace.